The phone rang at 2:07 in the morning and Daniel Cole was already half awake when it happened, the way men who have lost someone tend to stay half awake for years afterward, one ear always tilted toward the dark. He was on the couch because he'd fallen asleep there again, the television running on mute, a beer on the coffee table that had gone warm 2 hours ago. The number on the screen was one he didn't recognize. Out-of-state area code. Nobody called at this hour unless something had already gone wrong. His first thought was Sophie. She was 3 blocks away at her friend Zoe's house, and even though she was 10 years old and perfectly safe, that was still where his mind went first always, every time since the night 4 years ago when he'd gotten a call that turned out to be the worst kind of right number. He answered before the second ring finished. The voice on the other end was a woman's, breathless, broken up by the kind of silence that comes just after crying when a person is trying to hold themselves together and barely managing. "Please." A pause. "Room 302. I don't want to die alone." Daniel sat up straight. "You have the wrong number." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "I know. Please come anyway." The line went dead. He sat there holding the phone, the muted television throwing blue light across the far wall. And he thought about the rational thing, which was to set the phone down, finish the warm beer, and go back to sleep. He had a transmission rebuild waiting in the morning. He had Sophie to pick up by 9. He had an invoice from his parts supplier that he'd been putting off because looking at it required confronting math he wasn't ready to face. What he did not have was any good reason to get into his truck and drive across Portland at 2 in the morning for a woman he didn't know. He looked at the photograph on the bookshelf. Laura at 34, which was the age she would always be, now smiling in that slightly impatient way she had when someone was taking too long with the camera. Beside it, Sophie at her kindergarten graduation, gap-toothed and beaming, holding a construction paper diploma like it was a trophy she'd earned in actual combat. Daniel stood up, put on his jacket and picked up his keys. He called his neighbor Mrs. Patterson on the way out. 71 years old, retired schoolteacher, had offered approximately 40 times to be his emergency contact and apologized for the hour and explained there was a situation and could she please go over and be at his place in case Sophie came home early. Mrs. Patterson, who had survived a husband, 3 teenagers, and what she called the great appliance disaster of 2019, said she'd be there in 5 minutes and told him not to apologize again. Portland at 2 in the morning had a particular quality he'd noticed on other late nights, the traffic lights cycling through their colors for nobody, the wet streets reflecting everything back in long orange streaks. His truck was 12 years old and let the world know it with a specific combination of squeaks and rattles that he'd long since stopped hearing. It felt mismatched against the hospital parking garage when he pulled in, all that gleaming concrete and fluorescent light, the kind of brightness that didn't care what time it was. He found the elevator. He found the 3rd floor. He walked down a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air past a nurse's station where someone was typing without looking up, and he stopped in front of room 302 and stood there for a moment with his hand near the door. The rational voice was still going. He listened to it. He pushed the door open anyway. She was lying in the hospital bed with copper-red hair spread across the pillow, her face pale against the white sheets in a way that made the red of her hair look almost theatrical, like something out of a painting. Early 30s, maybe. She had the kind of features that would read as composed under most circumstances, but right now, there was nothing composed about her. She'd been crying, and she wasn't trying to pretend otherwise, and when she looked up at him, the confusion on her face was immediate. "You're not Derek?" "No." He stayed near the door, hands loose at his sides. "I'm Daniel. You called the wrong number." She looked at him for a long moment. He watched something move across her expression. Calculation, then disbelief, then something that might have been the specific variety of exhausted amusement that only comes to people who have been through enough that coincidence stops surprising them. "You came anyway." "Yeah." He glanced around the room at the IV stand and the monitors and the arrangement of medical equipment that he knew from 4 years of becoming an unwilling expert in such things. "I did." The door opened behind him and a doctor came in, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair cut short, moving with the efficiency of someone who measured her days in 15-minute intervals and resented it when they ran over. She glanced at Daniel, once registered him, and directed her attention to the woman in the bed. "Miss Ashworth, your latest results aren't what we hoped." "Doctor." Voss had the kind of voice that delivered difficult information without dressing it up, which Daniel had come to understand was a mercy, not a coldness. "The leukemia is advancing. We need to change the protocol tonight. The next 48 hours are going to be critical." Claire Ashworth didn't flinch. She nodded once, a small, precise movement that cost her something. He could see it in the way her hand closed around the bed sheet, knuckles going white, the only part of her that showed what she was actually feeling. Dr. Voss turned to look at Daniel. "And you are?" He answered before he'd finished deciding what the answer was. "Daniel Cole. I'm a friend of Claire's." The lie came out smoothly, which bothered him slightly, but not enough to correct it. The doctor nodded, visibly deciding something. "Would you step outside with me for a moment, Mr. Cole?" In the hallway, Voss spoke without preamble. Acute myeloid leukemia 3 months into treatment, and tonight's results showed the cancer was becoming resistant to the current approach. The new protocol they were switching to was more aggressive and would carry its own risks. The transition period was where patients were most vulnerable, not just physically, but in the ways that didn't show up on charts. "Her emotional state affects her physical resilience," the doctor said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a clinical truth rather than making a personal appeal. "If she wants you here, being here matters." Daniel looked down the hallway and then back at the doctor. "I'll stay as long as she needs." Voss gave him a brief nod and moved on to her next problem, and Daniel stood alone in that corridor for a moment, trying to locate the version of himself that had driven across town for a stranger, because he was going to need to understand that person's reasoning fairly soon. He went back into the room. Claire was watching the door when he came through it. The professional composure she'd managed for the doctor had softened at its edges, and what was underneath it wasn't fragility exactly. It was closer to the look of someone who has been braced for impact long enough that the muscles are starting to shake. "She give you the critical condition speech?" "She did. Most people head for the exit after that one." "I'm not most people." He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. "So, Claire Ashworth, tell me how a person ends up alone in a hospital at 2 in the morning." Something shifted in her expression. Almost amusement, almost irritation, as if she couldn't decide which response to have. "You recognize the name?" "I read the newspaper. Not every day, but enough." He shrugged. "Ashworth Communications. The telecom. Your father built it. You took it over after he died. Most people think I'm just some Victoria they've never met. Most people don't drive across town at 2 in the morning either." He settled back in the chair. "Seems like a night for exceptions." For the first time since he'd walked in, something in her actually relaxed just a degree, just enough to be visible. She was quiet for a moment, and then she started talking. Not the way people talk when they're performing being okay. The other kind. Warren Stiles had been her father's right hand for 3 decades, competent, loyal to her father, and furious in the precise way that people are furious when they believe they've earned something and someone else received it. When Edward Ashworth died, he left controlling interest in the company to Claire. He had not consulted Stiles about this decision. Stiles had been working around it ever since. "He thinks I'm weak," she said, not with self-pity, with the flat precision of someone reading off a fact from a document. "He's been waiting for a reason. The diagnosis gave him one." Derek had been her boyfriend for 2 years. He was in real estate development, handsome, good at parties, and capable of a kind of surface-level warmth that she'd mistaken for longer than she was comfortable admitting for something deeper. When the results started getting worse, when the word leukemia stopped being hypothetical and became specific and staged and real, he'd lasted 3 weeks before telling her he couldn't watch someone he loved disappear. She understood the sentiment. She hadn't spoken to him since. "Tonight the doctors told me the treatment wasn't working the way they'd hoped." She looked at the ceiling, at the particular nowhere that people look when they're trying to keep themselves together. "I called Derek because he was still on my phone and because it was 2 in the morning and I was scared. He didn't answer." A pause. I must have hit the wrong contact. Daniel thought about what it meant that the wrong contact had answered. He thought about the 40 or 50 contacts he had in his own phone and how many of them would drive across town at 2 in the morning if he called. He came up with a number, and the number was small enough to be uncomfortable. You said you didn't want to die alone. He said it directly, not gently, the way you'd say something that needed to be said without decoration. Are they telling you that's a real possibility tonight? They're telling me the next 48 hours are critical. Her eyes came back to his, which is a way of saying yes without saying it. Okay. He settled further into the chair. Then I'm staying. Tell me something else about Ashworth Communications. How does a telecom company work exactly? I've always wondered about the infrastructure side. She looked at him like he'd said something in a language she needed a moment to translate. Then she started talking about cellular infrastructure and tower networks and the particular challenge of maintaining rural coverage when the economics didn't favor it. And he asked questions that weren't polite questions but actual ones. And by the time the nursing staff came in to begin the new protocol, she had more color in her face than when he'd arrived. He talked, too, when the conversation found its way there. About Cole's auto, which he'd built from a 2-bay rental space in the 4 months after Laura died, mostly because he'd needed something that required his complete attention or he would have stopped functioning entirely. About the way Sophie had started coming to the shop after school when she was 7, sitting on an overturned bucket and watching him work, asking questions about why engines did what they did with the same relentless precision that she applied to everything that interested her. About the science fair project she'd done on automotive engine efficiency, which had placed 3rd in the district and which he still had framed in the office. About Laura. A little. Not too much. He'd learned over 4 years how to carry that weight without putting it down on other people. But enough that Claire would understand why he'd recognized something in that phone call. Why a woman's voice saying, "I don't want to die alone in the dark," had not been a thing he was able to leave unanswered. They talked until the light outside the window changed. It happened gradually, the way it always did. The darkness going from black to charcoal to a flat gray that meant morning was coming, whether the night was finished or not. The nursing staff moved in and out with their quiet efficiency. The monitors beeped their steady, unimpressed rhythms. Dr. Voss came back at 6:15, checked Claire's readings, and allowed herself a brief, visible relaxation of the shoulders that meant the news was better than it might have been. She said they'd continue monitoring through the day, but the initial response to the new protocol was encouraging. Claire waited until the doctor left. Then, "You came anyway." "You mentioned that already." "I know." She reached for his phone, which was sitting on the tray table, and he didn't stop her. She entered a number and handed it back. The contact read, "Claire Ashworth. In case you ever dial the wrong number again." He stood up to leave. He had a transmission rebuild waiting. He had Sophie to collect. He had a life on the other side of this hospital that was going to resume whether or not he was ready for it. He was halfway to the door when she said, "Daniel." He turned. "Thank you for coming anyway." He nodded once, which was all he had. Then he walked out into the morning. 3 days passed. He rebuilt the transmission. He picked up Sophie. He ate dinner at the kitchen table and helped with homework and watched half a baseball game before falling asleep on the same couch. He told himself the hospital had been an anomaly, the kind of thing that happens once in a life and then becomes a story you tell sometimes the night you drove across town for a stranger. He was closing up Cole's auto on the 3rd evening, running through the lockup routine with the muscle memory of 1,000 identical evenings when a black Lexus pulled into the lot. The man who stepped out was wearing a suit that cost more than Daniel's truck was worth, and he carried an envelope with the careful neutrality of someone who does this kind of thing professionally. "Miss Ashworth requests your presence at her home tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. The address is enclosed." He extended the envelope. "She said to tell you it's important." Daniel took the envelope. The man got back in the car and left. He almost didn't go. He thought about it seriously, weighed it the way he weighed decisions that had real consequences, not quickly, but with the kind of deliberate attention that his father had called giving something its due. Whatever Claire Ashworth wanted, it was going to be complicated. Her world and his didn't overlap in any natural way, and things that didn't overlap naturally had a tendency to cause problems at the seams. He went anyway. The Ashworth estate was on the west side of the city on a hill with a view of Portland's skyline that on a clear evening looked like something from a magazine. The driveway was longer than his block. There was a gate and a camera and a person at the gate who verified his name against a list before letting him through. He parked his truck between a Mercedes and a BMW and sat there for a moment, appreciating the specific comedy of it. A housekeeper led him through marble hallways to a sunroom that looked out over a manicured garden. Claire was standing at the window when he entered, dressed simply dark slacks, a cream-colored blouse, a silk scarf wound carefully around her head in a way that made its purpose clear without announcing it. She turned when he came in and she smiled, which seemed genuine in a way he hadn't expected. "You actually came. You said it was important." He looked around the room, the white furniture, the art on the walls, the kind of space that was designed to impress, and succeeded. He remained standing. The sofa looked like it would hold a grudge if he put his work-worn jeans on it. She gestured to a chair across from hers, and this time he sat. "I have a proposition," she said. "It may sound unusual. I hope you'll let me finish before you respond." He nodded. She explained it plainly without softening the edges. Acute myeloid leukemia treatable in theory, but months of aggressive therapy ahead, and an outcome that remained genuinely uncertain. The board of directors at Ashworth Communications had been watching her illness the way Warren Stiles had been watching it for months, not with concern, but with calculation. Stiles had been working on a narrative that she was too ill to lead, too isolated, too compromised by treatment and grief and whatever else he could attach to her, to make the picture look like incapacity. "He needs me to look weak," she said, "and right now the most effective way to look weak is to look alone." She needed someone she trusted, someone with no connections to her industry, no financial stake in the outcome, no possible angle that Stiles could identify and use, someone who had shown up when there was nothing in it for them. "I want to hire you, Daniel, to accompany me to treatments, to business meetings, to public appearances, to present the image that I'm not fighting this battle in isolation." She held his gaze without flinching. "I understand what I'm asking, and I'm prepared to compensate you accordingly. $1 million for 6 months of your time." He laughed. It came out before he could stop it, not dismissive, but genuinely surprised. "You want a fake boyfriend. I want someone I can trust. I'm a mechanic." He spread his hands, the calluses, and the faint ghost of engine grease that never quite scrubbed out. "I don't belong in your world. I have a kid at home. I have a business. I have—" He stopped. "This is insane. That's exactly why it works." Her voice was steady, not urgent. She wasn't selling him, she was explaining. "You have no agenda, no history with my industry, no connection to anything Stiles could weaponize." A pause. "And you showed up at 2 in the morning when you had absolutely nothing to gain. I don't have a lot of people in my life I can say that about." He thought about the money. He couldn't help it. $1 million was Sophie's college fund, fully funded with money left over. It was a real house in a real neighborhood with a real school district. It was the expansion at the shop he'd been sketching plans for on the back of invoices for 2 years, every time the volume justified it and the capital didn't. It was the specific kind of financial security that people who grew up without it understand to be about more than money, about the ability to stop doing the constant arithmetic of what can wait and what can't. "Let me think about it," he said. He drove home slowly, taking a long route, the truck's engine the only sound. He ended up at the cemetery without entirely planning to. The headstone was simple. Laura had insisted on that years before she needed to, in one of those practical conversations that neither of them had wanted to have, but which she'd forced them to have because she was practical even about the things she didn't want to be practical about. He stood there in the dark and talked to her the way he'd gotten in the habit of doing when something was too complicated for any of the people who were still alive. He told her about the hospital room and the woman with the copper hair and the conversation that had lasted until dawn. He told her about the offer and the number. He told her he wasn't sure what the right answer was, which was honest, which was more than he'd given himself credit for most of the day. What he couldn't figure out was whether he was considering saying yes because of Sophie, or because of something else that he wasn't ready to look at directly yet. Those two things needed to stay in their separate categories, and he wasn't sure they were staying. He went home. He checked on Sophie, who had gotten home from Zoe's and was asleep with a book on her face. He closed her door and stood in the kitchen for a while. In the morning, Sophie was at the kitchen table with her backpack in her lap, head bent over the strap, which had torn along the seam. She was sewing it closed with the small sewing kit she'd quietly taken from the junk drawer 6 months ago without asking, because she'd noticed it there, and she'd noticed it was useful, and she hadn't wanted to make a thing of it. She looked up when he came in and gave him the smile that still hit him somewhere below the sternum every time, because it was so precisely Laura's smile that it never quite stopped being a surprise. He called Claire after breakfast. "I'll do it." The words felt strange, coming out not wrong but unfamiliar, like a key he'd never used before. "But I have conditions. Sophie comes first always, without negotiation. I won't lie to her about what this is. And when it's done clean. No complications, no extensions, no renegotiating on your end without my consent." "Agreed." Her relief came through clearly, which told him she'd been less certain of his answer than she'd appeared. "When can you start?" 2 weeks. I need to make arrangements at the shop." "Make it 1. I'll cover any financial losses from the transition. My first treatment with the new protocol starts next Monday, and I want you there." It wasn't a request. He'd heard that register in people's voices before, the one that came from a life where requests were a formality, because the answer was already understood. He filed that away without responding to it directly. 1 week, he said. He talked to Ray on a Tuesday over coffee in the break room that smelled of motor oil and burnt grounds because nobody remembered to clean the machine. Ray Dunbar had been at Coles Auto for 6 years, starting as a second mechanic and becoming, through sheer competence and institutional memory, the person the shop actually ran through. Daniel gave him the partial version, a consulting engagement with a larger company advising on fleet maintenance, 6 months. Ray would manage day-to-day operations and get the corresponding pay bump. Ray looked at him steadily for a moment. "Fleet maintenance consulting. That's right. For 6 months. Give or take." Ray nodded slowly in the way of a man who has learned when questions are welcome and when they aren't. "Shop will be here when you get back." "I know it will." The conversation with Sophie was harder and required pizza, which was their standard protocol for discussions that needed to go well. They went to the place on Morrison with the checked tablecloths and the garlic knots that she'd been ordering since she was 5. He waited until she'd finished most of her first slice. He told her about Claire, that he'd be working closely with her for the next 6 months, helping her while she went through treatment. That it was a job and it was going to pay well, and it was going to change some things for them in good ways. He was careful with the words because Sophie was the kind of 10-year-old who noticed when words were being careful with themselves. "So you're going to be her friend?" Sophie said. "A paid friend." He winced because when she put it that way, it had a precision that was hard to work around. Something like that. "Are people going to think you're dating her?" "Probably." "Are you?" "No." He held her eyes. "But some people might say we are, and I don't want that to catch you off guard." Sophie chewed thoughtfully. She had a way of processing information that reminded him of watching an engine cycle through. You could almost hear the components engaging. "Does she know about Mom?" "A little. She knows I'm a widower. She knows about you." "Is she nice?" He thought about the woman who had talked about rural cellular coverage at 4 in the morning, who had asked him real questions about Sophie's science fair project, who had held herself together with visible effort while a doctor told her the treatment wasn't working. "She's complicated, but I think she's good." Sophie looked at the garlic knots. "If we're moving, can my room have a window seat?" He blinked. "I didn't say we were. You said this job pays well enough to change things." She looked up at him with an expression so exactly like Laura's that it stopped him mid-sentence. "That means we're moving. I want a window seat. And a dog. We always said we couldn't have a dog because the apartment's too small." He laughed, the tension breaking open into something lighter. "One thing at a time. Promise me 3 nights a week for dinner. At home at the table. Not at the mansion or wherever. 3 nights. I promise. And if she's ever mean to you, you quit." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Deal. The first Monday arrived with the particular energy of things that cannot be undone. A car came for him at 8. The driver was polite and professionally silent. The clothes that had been arranged for him, organized by Nina Reeves, Claire's personal assistant, who had greeted Daniel with the precise warmth of someone performing warmth for professional reasons, were hanging in the guest room of the Ashworth estate. Designer jeans, a cashmere sweater in a shade of dark green that someone with better color sense than him had selected. He put them on and stood in front of the mirror and looked like himself, wearing clothes that weren't his. Claire was in the foyer, dressed in black slacks and a cream blouse, a silk scarf covering her hair. She looked up when he came down the hall. Ready? As I'll ever be. He offered his arm with the kind of deliberate formality that was one step removed from a joke, and she laughed, a real one, not the managed kind. Chemo then, board meeting, she said, taking his arm. Her tone shifted. The doctors want me to reschedule the meeting. I can't. Stiles. He's watching for any sign that I'm pulling back. I give him that and he'll spin it into incapacity by Thursday. He didn't push back on the logic. He stored it beside what he already knew about her, that her judgment on this was better than his, that she'd been navigating this terrain a lot longer than he had, and that his job here was to be present, not to manage her. The oncology center was private quiet, in the way that expensive things are quiet. Better materials, softer edges. The same machines doing the same work under more flattering lighting. He'd been in treatment rooms before. He recognized the particular geography of IV stands and reclining chairs, and the careful neutral expressions of staff who had learned to read rooms quickly. He stayed in the room. Claire told him he didn't have to, that being seen in the waiting area would be sufficient. He pulled a chair close to her recliner and asked her to tell him how the board meeting was going to go, what Stiles would try, what she'd counter with what the 3 swing votes looked like, and how they were likely to read the room. She talked for 3 hours. Talked about her father's building philosophy and her own, which diverged in ways that mattered. Talked about the Community Connect concept she'd been developing. Local service hubs, real staff, real relationships with neighborhoods, rather than automated menus and offshore call centers, and why the board's resistance to it was both financially short-sighted and the kind of mistake that compounded over time. He asked questions that were worth asking, and she answered them fully, and somewhere in the middle of it she forgot to look at the drip. When the session ended, she was too fatigued to walk steadily. He put his arm around her waist without being asked, and they moved toward the exit together, and he felt through the cashmere how little she weighed. The photographers were waiting outside, which he'd been briefed about. He kept his expression neutral and his attention on getting Claire to the car safely, because that was the actual task and everything else was incidental. The photos hit the next morning. Ashworth Heiress finds unexpected support. He saw them on his phone during the drive to the estate, his own profile unguarded, focused on Claire, exactly what she'd needed, and nothing she'd had to ask him to manufacture. She was on the sunroom sofa when he arrived, tablet in hand, scrolling through coverage with the focused calm of a general reading battle reports. "These are better than I hoped." She looked up. "Thank you." Something in the phrasing sat wrong with him. The precision of it, the same tone she probably used to thank her caterer or her car service. He understood she didn't mean it that way, but it pointed at something he'd need to keep clear in his own head. This was a job with terms they'd both agreed to, and the terms didn't include being thanked like he'd done something remarkable. He was doing what he'd said he'd do. That was it. "Board meeting in 2 hours, he said. "Tell me about Stiles. What does he actually want?" She set the tablet down. "The company. Not the work of running it. He stopped caring about the work years ago. He wants what he thinks my father owed him. He thinks 30 years of service entitled him to a succession that didn't happen. So it's personal. Everything in a boardroom is personal. The financial language is just a different kind of suit." She stood, moving toward the hallway. "Speaking of which, Nina has some options for you in the guest room." And the options turned out to be 3 suits that collectively represented a data point about wealth he hadn't previously had access to. A tailor arrived to make adjustments with quiet professional efficiency. By the time they left for Ashworth Tower, Daniel looked like a man who belonged in the building they were entering. He did not feel like that man, but he'd spent enough time under cars in tight spaces to know the difference between comfort and capability. Ashworth Tower was glass and steel in downtown Portland, the kind of building that announced itself by not having to try. The lobby had the acoustic quality of a room designed to remind you of your scale. They moved through it with Claire setting the pace, deliberate, unhurried, the walk of someone who owned the building because she did. The boardroom held 18 people around a mahogany table that had probably been there since her grandfather. Daniel counted them while Claire made introductions. Most expressions fell somewhere between curious and professionally opaque. Warren Stiles sat directly across from Claire's chair at the head of the table, the specific position of someone making a statement without having to say anything. He was 62, silver-haired, with the groomed authority of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in every room except this one. He looked at Daniel the way a man looks at something he's already decided the value of. Claire spoke first without sitting. Her voice carried without volume the skill of someone who'd learned to hold rooms before she understood why the skill mattered. I want to address at the outset any concerns about my capacity to lead this company through the current period. She didn't look at Stiles specifically. She didn't need to. I'm undergoing treatment for leukemia. I won't minimize what that requires or pretend the schedule isn't demanding. What I will tell you is that the company's performance over the past quarter speaks for itself, and my commitment to the initiatives we've agreed on hasn't wavered. Stiles waited until she sat before he spoke. We appreciate the transparency, Victoria Claire. No one at this table questions your commitment. His voice was smooth, the kind of smooth that takes years to develop. We do have concerns about sustainability. Leadership requires availability and a certain consistency of focus that treatment protocols can make difficult. Daniel watched the room while Stiles talked. 2 of the swing votes were watching Claire's hands. He filed that away. When there was a pause that invited filling, he leaned forward slightly. He didn't perform calm. He had it because he'd spent years explaining technical problems to customers who were scared about their cars and needed to trust him before they could hear what he was actually saying. Mr. Stiles. He let the name sit there for a moment. In my experience, and I'll be the first to tell you, my experience isn't in telecom. The people who keep things running during hard stretches aren't the ones who were never under pressure. They're the ones who show up every day anyway. He held Stiles's gaze without adding anything to it. I've watched Claire show up every day. I think this board has as well. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of people waiting for more, the quiet of people recalibrating. Stiles recovered smoothly because he was good at his job. A touching sentiment, though sentiment doesn't appear on the quarterly report. No, Daniel agreed pleasantly. But Community Connect will in about 2 quarters. I'd be curious what you're projecting. He didn't know enough to go further than that, and he knew it, so he didn't. But he'd put a name to something Stiles didn't want named, and the 2 swing votes were now looking at their folders instead of at Claire's hands, which meant something had shifted. Under the table, Claire's hand found his and pressed once brief, deliberate. He pressed back. 2 weeks after the board meeting, Daniel was in the school pickup line with his window down, watching the doors for Sophie when a dark sedan pulled in and parked directly behind his truck. The door opened, and Warren Stiles stepped out. Gray suit, unhurried, as though parking behind someone's truck in an elementary school lot was a thing he did regularly. Daniel got out. Mr. Cole? Stiles smiled the way men smile when they've already decided how the conversation ends. I'll be brief. I know the terms of your arrangement with Claire Ashworth, the number, the duration, the structure. A pause calibrated for effect. I'd like to make you a counteroffer. $3 million. You inform the press that the relationship was manufactured, and you walk away. Sophie was in the car. Daniel could see her through the window, head down over her book, completely unaware. No. He kept his voice even. $3 million, Mr. Cole. That's 3 times what she's paying you. For your daughter's future. The emphasis on Sophie was deliberate, the calculated use of something real against the person who held it. I heard you the first time. He opened the driver's door. Stay away from my kid. He got in the truck. Sophie looked up from her book as he started the engine. Who was that man, Dad? He pulled out of the lot and thought about what was true and how to say it in a way that was also honest. Someone who thought he could buy something that isn't for sale. Sophie considered this with the gravity she applied to things that seemed important. Then she went back to her book. That evening, after she was asleep, Daniel sat in the kitchen with his phone in his hand, and the particular quiet of a house where a child is sleeping, which is its own category of quiet, full rather than empty. He thought about the 3 million. He thought about the specific look on Stiles's face, which was the face of a man who had made this kind of offer before and had it accepted and had adjusted his model of the world accordingly. He thought about what it would teach Sophie if he accepted it. Not the lesson he'd frame it as. The real one, the one kids absorb without being told from watching what the adults around them actually do when the cost gets real. He called Claire. Not to report the conversation, to say they needed to talk in person, not over the phone. She suggested the estate. He suggested somewhere neutral, and when she hesitated, he held his ground, and eventually she agreed. The cafe on Burnside was the kind of place that served good coffee without making you feel like you needed to know things about coffee to order it. Claire arrived in jeans and a simple sweater, a knit beanie replacing the silk scarf, and sat down across from him, looking less like the CEO of a major telecom company and more like a person who was tired and trying not to show it too obviously. He told her about Stiles and the 3 million. Her face went pale, not with fear, but with anger, which he was coming to understand was her default response to feeling cornered. He approached you at Sophie's school. Yes. That crosses a line. The words came out flat, controlled. He's never gone after anyone's family before. He knows what matters to me. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee. He knew the number Claire, the exact terms. He got that from somewhere. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her working through it. Derek, she said finally. He had access to conversations, to documents I kept at my apartment. I trusted him with information I shouldn't have. A pause. I trusted him with a lot of things I shouldn't have. He sold it to Stiles. Almost certainly. No surprise in her voice, which told him she'd been moving toward this conclusion already. He would have seen it as pragmatic. Derek is very good at being pragmatic about other people's things. The bitterness was controlled but real. He didn't address it directly. Some things needed to be acknowledged without being investigated. Stiles is going to escalate. This was a test run. I know. She looked at him across the table. You turned down $3 million. Yes. 3 times what I'm paying you. I can do the math. She was quiet again. Then slowly something shifted in her expression, some piece of the professional armor that she wore so constantly. It had probably become invisible to her, relaxing in a way that he suspected she didn't notice she was allowing. Why? He thought about the honest answer, which was more complicated than he was going to say out loud, and gave her the part that was true and sufficient. Because you called the wrong number in the middle of the night and I came anyway. I don't stop being that person because the number went up. Her hand moved across the table and rested on his, brief, deliberate, the same kind of contact as the boardroom, but carrying something different now. Something without strategy in it. Outside somewhere on Burnside, a car horn sounded. The coffee cooled between them, and neither of them reached for it, and the evening settled around the cafe like it was in no particular hurry. The headlines broke at 6:14 in the morning, before most of Portland had finished its first cup of coffee. Daniel saw them on his phone while standing in the kitchen of his apartment, still in the clothes he'd slept in, and the particular quality of the silence that followed was the kind that precedes a decision rather than follows one. Ashworth CEO pays mechanic $1 million to play boyfriend. The sub-headline was worse. A photograph of Claire handing him an envelope outside the estate, taken from an angle that stripped all context and left only transaction. Whoever had positioned the shot knew exactly what they were doing. He was at the estate by 7:30. Nina met him at the door with the focused efficiency of someone who had been awake since the story broke and had already moved past grief into operational mode. She briefed him on the way through the hallway. Ashworth Communications stock had dropped 15 points in pre-market trading. 3 board members had called already. The PR team was recommending a statement of denial. Claire had overruled them. He found her in the study, which was where she went when she needed to think, in a room that felt serious. The television on the wall was running cable news on mute, and she was watching the Chiron scroll with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not anger, not fear, but the specific focus of someone who has just received confirmation of something they'd been hoping wasn't true. "Derek," he said, because they'd talked about this the night before at the cafe, and he'd been right and neither of them had wanted to be right. "Derek." She didn't look away from the screen. "Nina confirmed it this morning. He met with Stiles 4 times in the past 6 weeks. The last meeting was 3 days after Stiles approached you at Sophie's school." A pause. "He sold everything he had access to. Documents, conversations, photographs from my apartment. Stiles paid him $200,000. The number was specific enough that someone had already done the accounting. He let it settle. "What are you going to do?" She turned from the screen then, and what was in her face was not the anger he might have expected, but something colder and more deliberate. Not the reaction of someone who'd been betrayed, the decision of someone who had already moved past the betrayal to what came after it. "Schedule a press conference for this afternoon. And I need Ryan Novak's number." He pushed back on the press conference, not because the instinct was wrong, but because she'd had treatment the previous day, and he'd seen how that cycle worked the day after, was when the body's accounting came due, the fatigue moving up through the system like a tide. She heard him out, and then overruled him with the simple directness of someone who had already weighed the same factors and reached a different conclusion. "I can, and I will," her voice carrying the particular finality that wasn't stubbornness but clarity. "The longer we wait, the more the story sets. Then I'm standing next to you." He didn't phrase it as a question because it wasn't one. Something moved through her expression briefly, not surprise exactly, but the register of something unexpected, something she hadn't built into her model of how this would go. She nodded once and called Nina in to begin preparations. The press conference was held at Ashworth Tower at 2 in the afternoon in the lobby atrium, where the acoustics and the sight lines favored the person behind the microphone. Claire had chosen the location deliberately, her building her terms, her frame. She stood before the assembled cameras and reporters with the posture of someone who had decided exactly how much ground she was willing to cede, which was none. She didn't deny. That was the thing that shifted the room. Within the first 30 seconds, the reporters had come prepared for defensive positioning, for the language of reputation management, for the careful construction of a version of events that didn't quite constitute a lie. Instead, she gave them something that required a different kind of attention. "Yes, when Daniel and I first met, our relationship began as an arrangement." Her voice was clear without being loud, reaching the back of the room through precision rather than volume. "I was frightened. I was facing a diagnosis that was trying to kill me, and I called the wrong number at 2 in the morning. This man," a brief pause that managed to carry weight without becoming theatrical, "drove across this city and sat with me through the worst night of my life. A complete stranger. Because someone needed him, and he was the kind of person who shows up." She looked at Daniel standing to her left, and the look was unscripted. He could tell because it held something unmanaged in it, something that hadn't been calibrated for cameras. "What I didn't expect was how quickly an arrangement becomes something you can't put a dollar figure on." He took her hand. He did it because she was trembling just slightly, just enough that he could feel it through the contact, and because nobody else in the room could see it, and because she would never mention it, and he wasn't going to either. The cameras caught the gesture and made it into something it partly was and partly had become in the making of it. The questions that followed were the expected ones. He answered 2 of them directly without performing warmth or indignation, the way he'd answer a customer who was asking about something they were legitimately uncertain about. Claire handled the rest with the kind of command that came from knowing her subject better than anyone asking about it. By 7 that evening, the coverage had changed direction. Wrong number love was trending. The 15-point drop in pre-market trading had mostly recovered. Stiles had given no public response, which meant he was recalibrating. That night, sitting in Claire's kitchen while Nina worked through the day's crisis management in the adjacent room, he said, "He's going to come at this from a different angle now. Claire poured her back to him. He always does. He's not going to attack the arrangement anymore. He's going to attack your judgment. Build a case that you're not capable of sound decision-making professionally, not personally. The arrangement is the opening argument, not the main one. She turned then, and he could see her processing it, running the logic against what she knew about Styles' method and history. He'll use the board meeting. He'll say I'm delegating strategy to someone without qualifications. He'll say you're compromised, that the medication is affecting your judgment, that the relationship is clouding it, that the business case for Community Connect came from a mechanic instead of from your leadership team. He paused. He's building a file. Every meeting you miss, every decision you make that can be attributed to anything other than your own sound mind. The quiet that followed had a different texture than most of their silences. It was the quiet of someone seeing the full shape of a problem for the first time and understanding that the shape is worse than the parts suggested. Claire set the glass down carefully. How do you know this is his next move? Because it's the move I'd make if I were trying to drive someone out without leaving visible fingerprints. You go after what they can't fully defend: their health, their state of mind, the things that have legitimate ambiguity built in. He met her eyes. I've seen it before. Different settings, same mechanics. She looked at him for a moment with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite reassessment, but was somewhere in the territory between them. Ryan Novak, she said. I want to call him tonight. Ryan Novak had made his name with a documentary about pediatric cancer patients that had won awards for doing the hardest thing in that genre, showing the truth of the experience without using the subject's suffering as spectacle. He was based in Portland, which was either a coincidence or the universe being unusually cooperative, and he agreed to a meeting within 24 hours of Claire's call. He arrived at the estate in a flannel shirt and carrying a coffee he'd brought himself, which Daniel liked immediately. He sat across from Claire in the study and listened to what she was proposing: full access. No editorial control on her end, no embargo on difficult footage, and his response was the measured interest of someone who was intrigued but not sold. Why? The question was direct. Most people with your profile want the opposite of this: control, approval rights, the ability to pull anything that doesn't serve the image. Claire didn't hesitate. Because control is what got me to that hospital room. I spent my entire adult life managing how I was perceived, what was seen, and what wasn't. And the result was that at 2 a.m, when I was genuinely frightened, the only number I could think to call was a man I'd spent 2 years treating like a social function. She let that sit. The controlled version of me was alone. I'm not interested in producing more footage of her. Novak looked at Daniel briefly, then back at Claire. If I see something I need to include that you don't want in the film, we have a problem. Then we have a problem, Claire said. I'd rather have that problem than the alternative. He agreed. The crew began the following week, small, unobtrusive, with strict parameters around Sophie, whose face would not appear in any footage, a condition Daniel had stated once without flexibility and which had been accepted without debate. The filming changed the texture of things. Having a camera present at meetings and at treatment sessions created a layer of accountability that was uncomfortable for everyone, which was exactly the point. Board members who had been managing their expressions carefully in Claire's presence became slightly more careful still, which made certain things visible that might otherwise have remained obscured. Styles filed an injunction within the week, claiming corporate privacy concerns. Claire's legal team produced the board approval she'd secured before Novak arrived. The injunction failed. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into filming, when Sophie came home from school with dried tears on her face and the careful, rigid posture of a child who has decided not to let anything else out until she's in a safe place. Daniel saw it through the windshield before she reached the truck door and had the specific experience of a parent watching something coming that he couldn't intercept. She got in. She put her backpack on the floor. She looked straight ahead. He didn't push. He drove. And after 4 blocks, she said, "Tyler Matthews showed everyone a picture of you taking an envelope from Claire. And then he called you a bad word I'm not going to say." Her voice was controlled in the way of someone controlling a voice. "I told him he was wrong and he was stupid and that you're the best dad in Portland. And then I punched him. Daniel kept driving. "Did you hurt him?" His nose bled. A pause. "I'm not sorry. You're going to have to be. For the punch, not the rest." She turned to look at him, and her face had broken open, the control giving way, and what was underneath was not only anger, but something more complicated, the accumulated weight of weeks of holding her chin up at school while other kids figured out that her father's situation was interesting to talk about. "He said you're only with her because she pays you. He said that in front of everyone." He pulled over. Not because he needed to, but because this required not driving. He turned to face her fully the way the conversation required. "What did you say?" "I said it wasn't true." Her jaw tightened. "But then I couldn't explain what was true because I don't totally know." She looked at her hands. "Is it true, Dad? Are you only there because she pays you?" The question had the precision of a 10-year-old who had inherited her mother's ability to locate the exact place where a thing was complicated. He took his time. "When it started, the money mattered. I won't tell you it didn't, but that's not what keeps me there now." He paused. "You can be there for more than one reason. The money and the caring about someone, those aren't opposites." Sophie thought about this with the seriousness she applied to things she was trying to actually understand, not just accept. "Okay," she said finally, "but I still think you should quit." "I know. Are you going to—" He looked out the windshield at the rain starting on the street. "Let me talk to Claire first." He dropped Sophie at home with Mrs. Patterson and drove to the estate. Claire was in the study reviewing footage with Novak when he arrived, and she read his face before he said anything and dismissed Novak with a quiet word. When it was the two of them, she turned her chair to face him directly, which was her way of saying she was ready to hear something she might not want to hear. He told her about Tyler Matthews and Sophie's nose punch and the question she'd asked in the truck. He told her he was thinking about ending the arrangement. He said it plainly without softening it into something easier to receive. Claire didn't soften her response either. "So your solution is to quit?" Not a question, a statement held up for examination. "My solution is to protect my kid." By teaching her that when something costs you something, you walk away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "The photographs exist, Daniel. The stories exist. You leaving doesn't make them disappear. It just adds a new story on top of them, the one where you confirmed that it was nothing by walking out when it got uncomfortable. Don't tell me how to parent. I'm not." Her voice stayed even. "I'm telling you what Sophie will remember, not the explanation you give her, the action." He stood up, sat back down. The room held the specific tension of two people who are both right about different parts of the same thing. "What's your alternative?" "Let me come to her school." She held up a hand before he could respond. "No cameras, no press, no arrangements. Just me at career day, the way any other person would show up." She leaned forward slightly. "Let the other kids meet the actual person instead of the headline version." His first reaction was no immediate protective, the reflex of a father who had been watching his daughter absorb collateral damage for weeks. But the reflex and the reasoning weren't identical, and he'd learned to tell them apart. He sat with it for a long moment. "One condition. If I see one camera, one journalist, anyone who looks like they're there for the story rather than the event, we're done. No warning, no discussion." "Agreed." "And you don't use Sophie. Not for the documentary, not for a statement, not for anything. She's not part of this." "She never was." Claire's voice carried something in it that wasn't defensive. It was the weight of someone stating a thing they meant without reservation. "I care about her, Daniel. That wasn't in the contract." He left without resolving the larger question of whether he was staying or going, because some questions need to be slept on before the answer has any chance of being the right one. But he did not quit that night. The week that followed had a different quality from the weeks before something had shifted in the room between them, the kind of shift that happens when people have said the true version of a thing to each other and can't entirely go back to the approximate version. He was still doing the job. She was still managing the crisis with Stiles on one side and the documentary camera on another. But there was a new carefulness in their interactions that wasn't distance. It was more like the care you take with something you've realized is breakable. Sophie spent a Saturday at the estate working on her sketchbook in the sunroom, while Claire sat beside her, not instructing exactly but pointing out things, the way the light from the garden changed the shadow on the windowsill, how the eye follows a line differently when the weight is shifted toward the left. Daniel watched from the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee he'd stopped drinking, recognizing the look on his daughter's face as the particular concentration of someone finding something they didn't know they'd been looking for. He'd always assumed Sophie would follow him into mechanics eventually. She loved the shop, loved the logic of engines, loved the satisfaction of a thing running correctly because you'd made it run correctly. He'd been building toward showing her that world, the early mornings, the apprenticeship, the craft of it. It had never occurred to him to wonder what she might find on her own. "She has a real eye," Claire said quietly later when Sophie had gone to wash her hands. "The way she renders space, most adults never develop that instinct. She sees where things actually are not where she expects them to be." Daniel looked at the sketch Sophie had left on the table, the rose garden outside the window, the proportions right in a way he couldn't have achieved himself. "I didn't know she could do that." "That's not a criticism." Claire said it gently, without edge. "It's just sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest to see clearly." He thought about that for longer than the conversation required. 2 weeks after the career day arrangement had been made on a Tuesday morning, Ray called from Cole's Auto. His voice had the specific flatness of someone delivering bad news they'd rather not be delivering. A team from the health department and the environmental compliance office had shown up 90 minutes ago with a list of violations that Ray had never seen before: hazardous material disposal protocols, drainage containment, record-keeping discrepancies. The inspector had cited 12 separate issues and left a notice that could result in immediate closure if not remediated within 72 hours. Daniel sat with the phone against his ear and understood with a clarity that was almost physical what this was. The shop had passed its last inspection 6 months ago without a single citation. The violations being cited were the kind that accumulated over years of actual neglect, not 6 months of careful operation. Someone had made calls, pulled records, found pressure points in the regulatory system, and applied pressure to them. The logic of it pointed in one direction. He drove to the shop. He stood in the bay and looked at the inspection notice and felt something that wasn't quite anger. It was closer to the feeling of watching someone break a rule that you'd assumed everyone understood you didn't break. Cole's Auto was not part of the arrangement. It was not part of anything that had to do with Claire or Stiles or Ashworth Communications. It was the thing he'd built in the worst year of his life to give himself a reason to get up every day, and the idea that it had become a lever for someone else to pull was a violation of something he didn't have precise language for. He called Claire from the parking lot. Not to ask her to fix it, he had already decided he was not going to ask her to fix it, and he held that decision carefully because he knew what she would offer, and he knew how he would feel about accepting it. He called because she needed to know that Stiles had crossed a line that changed the calculus. She offered immediately. Lawyers' contacts at the city, the full resource of the Ashworth legal department. He heard the offer and said no, and the no came out sharper than he intended because some things that are right still land hard. "This is my shop," his voice carrying more than the words, everything underneath them surfacing without permission. "I built it after Laura died. I built it when the only alternative was staying in the apartment watching Sophie not talk about the fact that her mother wasn't coming home. When this arrangement ends, the shop is all I'll have left of who I was before any of this, and I need to know I can still handle it myself." The silence on the other end was a specific kind of silence, the silence of someone absorbing something they hadn't known they were going to hear. When Claire spoke again, her voice had changed, pulled back to somewhere more careful. "When this arrangement ends," she said quietly, just repeating the phrase, not making a point of it, just letting it exist in the air between them. "I'll handle it," he said. "Okay." He did handle it. It took 11 days, 4 conversations with former customers who had connections at City Hall, 1 formal appeal filed by an attorney he'd used for the shop's lease 2 years ago, and a documented counter-inspection that the city was legally required to conduct when challenged. The citations were overturned. The shop stayed open. He didn't tell Claire how much of himself it had cost to do it that way, instead of accepting the easier path she'd offered. He thought she probably knew anyway. The silence between them lasted 9 days. Not a hostile silence, the kind that happens when two people have said something real and are living with the echo of it. They continued the scheduled treatments, one board function, 2 public appearances that Nina had managed to schedule around Claire's fatigue cycles. They were professional. They were competent. Sophie noticed immediately. "You're both doing the thing Zoe's parents did," she said over dinner at the apartment, the 3 of them around the small table that barely fit 3 people, a fact that had never bothered him until he started comparing it mentally to other tables he'd sat around, where they talked to each other like everything was totally fine, but they wouldn't look at each other. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate. "We had a disagreement. Grown-up things. Zoe's dad said that too." She stabbed her chicken with unnecessary precision. "He lives in Seattle now." The comparison sat uncomfortably because it was wrong in the specific way that true things are wrong when they're about the wrong situation. The feelings it stirred were accurate, even if the analogy wasn't. That evening after Sophie was asleep, he drove to the estate without calling ahead. Nina let him in without comment, which told him that Nina had noticed the 9 days as well. He found Claire in her home office, sitting at the desk with the lights low, and a glass of water she hadn't touched, and a financial report she wasn't reading. She looked up when he came in. "I shouldn't have said it the way I said it." He sat down in the chair across from the desk, the one he'd used in 100 working sessions. "About the shop, about when this ends. I was angry, and I put it on you when I should have put it on Styles where it belonged." She was quiet for a moment. "You weren't wrong about the shop. It is yours. I did overstep." A pause. "I overstep when I'm frightened. It's a bad habit dressed up as competence." The admission cost her something. He could see it in the way she said it, the particular effort of someone stating a flaw without caveating it into something smaller. He thought about what it meant that she'd said it at all to him in the low light of a room where nobody else was going to hear it. "I've been running," he said. "Not physically, but every time something between us starts to feel real, I remind myself it has a contract attached to it. I remind myself it has an end date." He looked at the surface of the desk between them. "That's not fair to either of us." She didn't fill the silence, which he'd come to understand was one of her qualities. She could sit in a silence without the urge to cover it, which was rare. "I don't know what we are," he said finally, "but I know I stopped treating it like a job somewhere back there. I'm not sure exactly when." When she looked up at him, there was something unguarded in it, the version of her face that came out occasionally, usually at the wrong moments, or in unlit rooms, the one without strategy. "Neither am I." Career Day at Westview Elementary was a Thursday in October, cool and gray in the way Portland Octobers specialize in. Claire arrived in Nina's car, borrowed because the Ashworth town car would have been too visible, and she walked in through the main entrance without fanfare. Jeans, a simple sweater, the knit beanie she'd taken to wearing instead of the silk scarf on days when she was off the clock, which Daniel had noticed was happening more often. She sat in Sophie's classroom on a folding chair and talked to 32 fourth graders about how information moved satellites and towers and the invisible infrastructure that connected every phone call any of them had ever made. She was good at it in the way that people are good at things they actually care about, not just things they've prepared for. She answered questions about space and about whether satellites could see your house, and about how fast information moved, and about whether her phone had ever dropped a call during an important meeting. "Yes," her voice carrying its natural amusement. "During a call with our most important investor. It dropped 3 times. He thought I was hanging up on him." 32 children laughed, and Sophie laughed loudest. And the girl sitting next to Sophie, the one who had been in the group that had watched Tyler Matthews' phone, was laughing with her. At the end, Claire talked about connection, not the technical infrastructure kind. "The most powerful connection I've ever experienced wasn't wireless," she said. "It was a phone call at 2 in the morning, a wrong number, and a person on the other end who showed up anyway. Technology helps us find each other, but the showing up that part is still entirely human." She had lunch in the cafeteria at the table Sophie led her to, on a plastic chair, eating pizza from a tray. She answered more questions. She deferred to Sophie's expertise on the subject of how car engines worked, which made Sophie sit up straighter. Daniel was not there for any of this. He'd agreed it should be that way, that Claire needed to be a person there, not the appendage of a narrative. He heard about it from Sophie in the car on the way home in the detailed and slightly breathless account of someone recounting an event they're still processing. She sat on the lunch table chair and she didn't even make a face about it, Sophie reported. Tyler Matthews asked her if she was really sick and she just said yes and that she was fighting it. And he didn't say anything mean. He just said okay. A pause. She's actually really cool, Dad. Yeah, he said. She is. Do you love her? He kept his eyes on the road and let the question sit for a moment before he said, It's complicated, Sophie Bug. She made a sound that was the 10-year-old equivalent of an eye roll. You love her, she said with the confidence of someone who has already arrived at a conclusion and is simply waiting for the adult to catch up. She looks at you the way Zoe's mom looks at her new husband, like she's making sure you're still there. He didn't answer, but he drove home thinking about the way people look at things they're not yet sure they're allowed to keep. Derek Holt arrived at the Ashworth Oncology Center on a Thursday 2 weeks after Career Day during Claire's scheduled treatment. Daniel saw him in the lobby from across the room, the particular ease of a man who had practiced his expression in a mirror before arriving composed into something that read as concern and probably wasn't. He got between Derek and Claire before Derek reached them. Not by moving dramatically, but by simply being in the way. The way a wall is in the way, not aggressive, just present. She has treatment in 10 minutes. Derek raised his hands in the gesture of someone demonstrating harmlessness. I'm not here to cause trouble. I saw the Chronicle piece. I wanted to apologize in person. His voice was calibrated to carry just slightly further than the distance between them. Staff had looked up from the desk. A patient near the window had turned. She doesn't need your apology. Daniel's voice staying conversational without heat, which was more effective than heat would have been. She has everything she needs. Derek looked past him at Claire. I still care about what happens to you. Still at the same carrying volume, still building the scene for the audience. Whatever happened between us, I want you to know that. Claire looked at Derek with an expression that was entirely absent of what Derek was hoping to find there. I know what you want me to know, Derek. Her voice was flat with the particular flatness of someone who has finished grieving something and moved past the wreckage. Daniel is right. I have treatment. The nursing coordinator arrived with a clipboard and the quiet authority of someone who had removed people from oncology waiting rooms before and found it neither difficult nor interesting. Derek retreated. He was gone by the time they reached the treatment room, but the photographs taken by the person he'd positioned in the lobby were already uploading. By that evening, 3 entertainment news sites had a version of the story Love Triangle at Portland Cancer Center Wells X reappears. The name was wrong, but the damage was directional. In the car afterward, Claire pale from treatment and looking straight ahead, Daniel said, He knew exactly when your appointment was. Yes. Stiles told him. Of course he did. She turned her head slightly against the headrest to look at him. Derek and Warren have been coordinating since the diagnosis. Derek gave him the information about our arrangement. Warren gave Derek the script. She paused. It's not personal for either of them. That's the part I had to understand. It's purely mechanical. It's still personal. Yes. She looked back at the windshield. It still is. 3 weeks later, at a charity gala at the Heathman Hotel in the brief shelter of a corridor beside an elaborate floral arrangement, Daniel overheard what he'd been waiting to hear, not because he'd been listening for it specifically, but because Stiles was the kind of man who had learned to trust expensive walls. 2 voices. Low. Careful. 2 board members based on the fragments he'd caught over the past months, the names, the cadence, the vocabulary of people who spent their lives in conference rooms. Stiles is moving next week. Confidence vote. He's got documentation, medical records showing cognitive impacts from the medication decision-making patterns from the past quarter that he's framing as compromised judgment. The first voice, cautious, not enthusiastic. The numbers have been solid. The second voice, he's not arguing the numbers. He's arguing her capacity to make the decisions that produce the numbers. The board won't like that the Community Connect analysis came from an outside party with no credentials. A pause. He says it's only a matter of time before she makes an error she can't recover from. He wants to move before that happens. Daniel felt Claire's grip on his arm tighten, the pressure measured and controlled, not the press of panic, but the press of someone absorbing a blow without going down. He steered them gently away before the conversation could continue, finding a quieter alcove near the far side of the ballroom. She was composed when he looked at her, the public face complete. Underneath it, for just a moment, he saw what it cost her to hold that face in place. In the car on the way back, she said, "He's going to use you as evidence of impaired judgment, delegating to someone outside the organization, allowing personal feelings to influence professional decisions." I know. If he wins the vote, he won't. He said it without performing certainty, which was what made it land differently than reassurance. Because I'm not going to let it happen. She looked at him across the dark interior of the car. This was never your fight. The words had been true once, a long time ago, maybe the length of 6 months ago, which felt much further than 6 months. He thought about the cafe on Burnside, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and a woman who had let something unguarded show in a public place, and what it meant that he still remembered the exact temperature of that particular silence. "It became mine," he said, "the night you called." She didn't say anything after that. She didn't need to. They reached the estate at 11. He walked her to the door, which he'd done 100 times, and this time she stopped at the threshold and turned. The porch light was behind her, and the expression on her face was the one he'd been careful not to look at directly for weeks. The one that required a response he'd been postponing because postponement had felt like caution and was probably something else. "Is this still just business to you?" Her voice quiet, direct. The question without softening. He looked at her and thought about the transmission rebuild he'd finished the morning he drove to the hospital. He thought about Sophie's drawing of the rose garden, which was better than he could have made with 10 years of practice. He thought about 11 days of handling a regulatory fight alone because the cost of being helped was something he'd understood imperfectly and was only now beginning to revise. It stopped being business a long time ago. His voice rougher than he'd expected, the honesty working its way past the part of him that was still keeping inventory of all the reasons this was complicated. "I just kept the ledger going so I'd have somewhere to put it." She put her hand against his chest, not reaching for him, just placing it there like a fact. Then she looked up and he stopped calculating, and the distance between them closed with the particular irreversibility of things that have been true for a while before they become undeniable. When they stepped back, both of them understood that the end date on the contract they'd signed 6 months ago was no longer the most relevant date on the table. The morning after the porch came with the particular disorientation of waking in a familiar place that has quietly rearranged itself overnight. Daniel lay in the guest room of the Ashworth estate, the same room he'd used a dozen times when late meetings ran past the point where driving made sense, and stared at the ceiling while the city outside the windows assembled itself back into Portland. The light was the specific gray of early November non-committal, the kind that could go either direction. He heard movement in the kitchen below, the sound of water running, and then the small percussion of cabinet doors, and lay there listening to it the way you listen to something you're not sure you're allowed to find comforting. He went downstairs. Claire was at the counter in pajamas and the knit beanie she'd started wearing around the house, making tea with the focused attention of someone who needed a task that required just enough concentration to organize the morning around. She looked up when he came in. The expression she had was careful in the way of someone who had said a true thing the night before and was waiting to find out what the daylight did to it. "I don't know how to do this part," she said, not apologetically. Just honestly, the way she stated things, she'd decided to stop managing. Be a person in the morning instead of a position. He poured coffee from the carafe she'd already made. "You're doing fine. I make tea when I'm nervous. It's a terrible tell." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "I've been making tea since 5:30. He almost said something reassuring and stopped himself because she wasn't asking for reassurance. She was doing the thing she'd said she was bad at, which was being a person, and the correct response to that was to be won back. "What are you nervous about?" She looked at him over the mug. "That you'll decide in the daylight that last night was a complication you didn't sign up for." "I signed up for 6 months," he said. "I think we're past the question of what I signed up for." Something in her shoulders settled not dramatically but visibly, the release of a tension she'd been carrying through the whole of the tea-making. Nina arrived at 7:15 with a tablet and the day's first set of problems, and the kitchen rearranged itself back into operational territory, and whatever the morning had been privately became something they carried separately through the logistics of what came next. The board meeting was 5 days away. Everything pointed at it. Claire worked through those 5 days with the focused intensity of someone who has identified the moment everything converges and is refusing to arrive at it underprepared. She reviewed every quarterly report from the past 2 years. She ran projected responses to 17 different angles Styles might take. She had Nina pull the personnel files on the 2 swing votes and read them carefully enough to understand not just their professional positions, but the particular pressures each man was navigating. She was good at this, the preparation, the strategic construction, the chess of it, and watching her work was like watching a craftsman in the final hours before a deadline, economical, precise, nothing wasted. By Thursday, she was running on fumes held together by will. Daniel watched her push through a working dinner without eating more than a third of what was on her plate, watched her hand tremble slightly when she reached for her water glass, watched her correct a number in a financial projection, and then correct the correction because the fatigue was doing math on her behalf. He waited until Nina had gone for the evening. Then he closed the folder she was reaching for. 2 days, he said. Off the grid before Monday. Not a negotiation. She looked at the closed folder and then at him with the expression she used when someone had said something she disagreed with but couldn't immediately disprove. "I have 17 additional scenarios to work through." "You've worked through enough scenarios to staff a consulting firm. What you haven't done is sleep for more than 4 hours at a stretch in a week." He held her gaze. "You need to walk into that room Monday able to stand up for an hour. Right now, you couldn't stand up for 30 minutes without the medication doing your arithmetic for you. That's what Styles is counting on." The pause that followed was the pause of someone who knows the argument is correct and is deciding whether to accept it anyway. "Where?" she asked finally. "The cabin." They drove up Friday morning, Sophie in the back seat with her sketchbook and her headphones and the particular self-sufficiency of a child who has learned to travel well. The Mount Hood cabin was smaller than any room in the estate, which was part of why it worked. The proportions were human. The furniture was worn in the way of things that had been used rather than displayed, and the windows looked out at forest and a small lake that had no opinion about Ashworth Communications or its board of directors. Sophie was out the door within 4 minutes of arrival, heading for the water with the purposeful energy of a child who has been inside too long. Claire stood on the porch watching her go, and something in her posture was different from the posture she maintained in Portland. The defensive architecture of it, the constant readiness had relaxed by a visible degree. Not gone, just resting. They spent the first day doing almost nothing by design. Sophie explored the lake's perimeter and reported back on the wildlife at intervals. Claire read a novel she'd brought, an actual novel, not a business document, and Daniel made dinner from what was in the cabin's pantry, which turned out to be a reasonable chili and cornbread that Sophie declared better than anything produced in the estate kitchen, which was almost certainly untrue but kindly meant. That evening Sophie sat with Claire at the kitchen table and drew while Claire looked on occasionally, pointing out things about the way the cabin lamp threw its light across the table's surface. Daniel washed dishes and listened to them talk, Sophie explaining her theory about how different engines made different sounds based on their size, Claire asking questions that were genuinely curious rather than performed, both of them in the easy register of people who have found a shared frequency without having to negotiate for it. He thought about what it meant that his daughter had found something in this woman that he'd been slower to let himself find. Kids were not sentimental about people. Sophie's acceptance was not the product of wanting something to be true, it was the product of seeing something that was. The second night, with Sophie asleep in the cabin's loft, he and Claire sat on the deck with the lake invisible in the dark below them, the forest making its quiet sounds, the temperature just cold enough to make the blanket she'd brought out across her lap necessary. He'd been thinking about how to say the thing he'd been circling for weeks, and somewhere over the lake, he stopped thinking about how to say it and said it. "Our arrangement ends in 3 weeks." He kept his voice level, neither softening the fact nor sharpening it. "Technically, I'm aware." She was looking at the dark where the lake was. "I stopped thinking about the end date a while ago." A pause. "So did I." Another pause longer. "I'd like to renegotiate. Not the financial terms." She turned to look at him, and in the dark, her face was more readable than it was in lit rooms, as though the dark removed one of her defenses without her choosing to remove it. "Whether this is something you want, without the contract, without the performance. Whatever it looks like when the arrangement isn't holding it in place." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him without calibrating the gesture, without thinking about what it communicated to a room, because there was no room. "No more arrangements," he said. "One day at a time. Just the actual thing, whatever it is." She turned her hand in his and held on. The lake made no sound. The forest said whatever it said at that hour to anyone willing to sit still long enough to hear it. Monday arrived with the gray certainty of something that had been coming for a long time. They drove back to Portland Sunday evening, and by the time the city appeared through the windshield, the cabin had receded into something they were both carrying internally, a reserve. Sophie was delivered to Mrs. Patterson with her backpack and specific instructions about the science project due Wednesday, and Daniel drove to the estate where the morning's preparation would begin. Ryan Novak and his crew were already there when they arrived at Ashworth Tower. The board had approved the documentary filming at this session, and Stiles had filed his second injunction attempt the previous week, this one also unsuccessful, also disposed of by Claire's legal team with the efficiency of people who had been expecting it. The crew set up in the corridor outside the boardroom, which was as close as the board's own approval would allow, and Novak himself took a position near the doorway where he could read the room through the glass. The 18 board members were present when Daniel and Claire entered, which itself was information nobody had skipped the meeting they suspected would be the decisive one. Stiles was in his customary position directly across from Claire's chair at the head of the table, and his expression this morning was the particular expression of a man who has looked at his cards privately and found them adequate. Margaret Whitfield, who had been on the Ashworth board since before Claire was born, sat at the far end with the stillness of someone who intended to watch everything before she said anything. Claire took her seat. Daniel stood behind and slightly to her left, not in the visitor section, not at the table, but in the space that communicated presence without claiming standing. The positioning was deliberate, and everyone in the room understood what it communicated. She didn't need him in the room to win. He was there because she'd wanted him there, which was a different thing entirely. Stiles began without preamble, which was the move of someone who had decided that control of the first impression was worth the social cost of bypassing convention. He laid out his case with the smooth technical competence of a man who had been building it for months, treatment-related cognitive assessments, a pattern of delayed decisions during the weeks following chemotherapy sessions, 3 instances in the past quarter where Claire had delegated final sign-off on significant operational decisions rather than executing them herself. He presented a timeline. He presented comparative leadership metrics from 2 peer companies whose CEOs had also managed serious illness. The implication of the comparison was precise and damning without ever being stated directly. "We don't question Miss Ashworth's courage," his voice carrying the concerned cadence that he'd clearly practiced until it no longer sounded practiced. "Her commitment to this company during an extraordinarily difficult personal period has been admirable. But this board has a fiduciary responsibility to 17,000 employees and to shareholders who depend on stable leadership. Courage is not a substitute for capacity, and we would be failing in our obligations if we allowed personal admiration for her fortitude to override our professional judgment about what this company requires." The room was quiet in the way of rooms where everyone has an opinion and nobody wants to be first. Claire opened the notebook in front of her, looked at it briefly, then closed it. She stood. "Everything Director Stiles has said about my health is accurate." The room's quality of attention shifted immediately, This was not what they'd prepared for. "I have leukemia. The treatment protocol I've been on since September is aggressive and carries real cognitive side effects during the week following each session. There have been meetings I've operated below full capacity. There have been decisions I've delegated during those windows because I knew my judgment was temporarily compromised, and delegating was the responsible choice." She let that sit. "All of that is true." Stiles's expression underwent a small, careful adjustment, the look of a strategist encountering terrain that doesn't match the map. What Director Stiles declined to present is the company's performance across the same period. She placed a single sheet on the table and slid it to the center without dramatics. Market share up 12%. Customer satisfaction at a 5-year high. The Community Connect pilot in South Portland showing a 40% improvement in retention and a cost per acquisition that undercuts our previous model by a third. She looked at Stiles directly for the first time since she'd begun speaking. "I built all of this while undergoing treatment that would have kept most people in bed. Not because I was reckless with my limitations, but because I understood them precisely enough to work within them and around them." She moved her gaze to the table, broadly landing briefly on the 2 swing votes. "Yes, I brought in outside perspectives, including Daniel's, because the best decision I've made as CEO of this company was understanding that the people closest to an industry are not always the ones who can see it most clearly." An outsider asked why our customer service model was entirely automated, and the answer to that question became our most successful initiative in 5 years. She paused. "That's not compromised judgment. That's exactly the kind of thinking this company has needed and hasn't had enough of." Daniel stepped forward, then not dramatically, not with a prepared speech, just the step of a man moving to a place in a room where he had something to contribute. He waited until several faces turned toward him. "May I address the board directly?" "Stiles. You have no standing in this proceeding, Mr. Cole. You're a guest of the CEO, not a party to Margaret Whitfield." From the far end, without inflection, "Let him speak." He didn't use the language of the room, the corporate vocabulary, the financial framework, the precise diction of people who had spent careers inside these walls. He spoke the way he spoke to customers who needed to understand something true about their vehicle before they could make a good decision directly without ornament, assuming they were intelligent enough to follow if he was clear enough to lead. "In my shop, when something's failing in a way that doesn't match the car's history, there's usually a reason that isn't the car. You follow what changed and you find what's driving the failure." He placed Nina's folder on the table. "Director Stiles has had 7 meetings with executives at Meridian Communications over the past 5 months. Meridian made an acquisition offer for Ashworth Communications that Claire rejected because it was priced 30% below market valuation. These meetings began 2 weeks after that rejection." He opened the folder to the first page, the authentication chain, the dates, the documented contacts. The system that recorded these meetings was built by Edward Ashworth specifically to monitor board member communications with competitors. It's been running continuously since his death. Nina Reeves activated the alert protocol 6 weeks ago. The quality of silence in the room changed again, a different register from the silence after Claire's speech. That silence had been the silence of people absorbing an argument. This was the silence of people absorbing a revelation and beginning to calculate what it cost them. "Stiles. These documents are fabricated. This is exactly the kind of—" Claire, her voice precise and without heat. "They've been authenticated by 2 independent forensic accounting firms, Richard, and the SEC received a copy of the complete file this morning." She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has finished being patient. "My father spent 30 years watching you. He knew what you were the entire time he employed you, and he kept you because you were useful. He also built a system to make sure that what you were could be documented if you ever decided the opportunity was worth the risk." She picked up her pen. "He left it for me." Stiles stood. He was controlled, the control of a man who has operated in high-stakes rooms his entire adult life and knows how to absorb a reversal without visibly staggering. But his next sentence, when it came, had a flaw in it that everyone in the room could hear. It was defensive. He'd been arguing from strength for 40 minutes, and now he was arguing from a different place entirely. Margaret Whitfield didn't wait for him to finish. "I think we have sufficient information to proceed to the vote." Her voice carried the particular authority of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has identified it. "Those in favor of retaining Claire Ashworth as Chief Executive Officer of Ashworth Communications." 16 hands. Immediate, without hesitation, the movement of people who had made their decision before the vote was called. 2 more after a pause of 5 seconds, the swing votes who had watched the folder and made their calculation. Stiles kept his hand on the table. His remaining ally did the same. The gesture had the quality of a formality they both knew was finished. Claire nodded once. "Thank you." She gathered her materials with the unhurried precision of someone for whom the next item on the agenda is already clear. "The regular quarterly meeting will proceed Thursday as scheduled." She walked out. Daniel followed. In the elevator, the doors closing on the boardroom floor, she stood with her back against the wall and breathed. Not dramatically, just the specific exhalation of someone releasing pressure that has been building for months, the body doing what the mind had been preventing it from doing in any room where being seen mattered. He stood beside her and said nothing because nothing was what the moment required. "The remission," he said when the elevator had moved 3 floors. "Is it real?" She turned her head to look at him. "Dr. Voss confirmed it Friday, before we went to the cabin." Her voice was quiet, careful with the information as though it might still break if mishandled. "I didn't want to tell you before the meeting. I needed the board to see me as their CEO, not as a patient who got good news. I needed them to choose the leadership, not the recovery." He looked at her for a long moment. The elevator reached the lobby. Neither of them moved immediately. "It's real," she said again, answering the question he hadn't asked again because he'd needed to hear it twice. He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and they stood like that while the elevator doors opened, and then after a moment considered closing again before a sensor stopped them. He didn't say anything about the months of sitting in treatment rooms, or the 11 days with the regulatory fight, or the night at the cafe when a cup of coffee went cold between them, or any of the accumulated weight of the past 6 months that had been resting on this outcome as one of its possible resolutions. He didn't need to. She knew what the silence contained. The SEC investigation into Stiles's communications with Meridian became public 4 days later. He resigned from the board the same afternoon before the formal request for his resignation could be made. His attorney released a statement. It said very little in a great many words, which was the attorney's job. The investigation itself would take the better part of a year, but the outcome of the board meeting meant it proceeded without any capacity to affect Ashworth Communications' leadership structure. Claire called a press conference on Thursday. She wore a suit in a shade of deep blue and stood at the podium in the lobby atrium, the same place she'd stood 3 months ago when she'd turned a story about a paid arrangement into something the public had decided to root for. This time what she had to say was different in kind. "Effective immediately, I am stepping down as Chief Executive Officer of Ashworth Communications." The room's reaction was the immediate collective intake of breath that major announcements produce in rooms full of people whose job is to report them. She held the moment without filling it. "I am not leaving this company. I am transitioning to the role of chairwoman of the board, where my focus will be long-term strategy, the Community Connect expansion, and the company's direction over the next decade. Day-to-day operational leadership will pass to Nina Reeves, who has been the operational intelligence behind every significant initiative of the past 5 years and whose judgment I trust without reservation." The questions were immediate and overlapping. She answered them with the patience of someone who had prepared for every angle. The health question came from 3 different reporters in 3 different formulations. Her answer was the same each time. This decision came from reflection, not from illness. And it came from understanding that the right leader for the company she wanted to build was the one who could give it full daily attention, which she could not, and which Nina could. One reporter near the back waited until the formal questions were winding down. "What about Daniel Cole? Does your relationship continue now that you're stepping back from the CEO role?" She paused. The pause wasn't strategic. It was the pause of someone deciding how honest to be in a room where honesty would be quoted. She looked toward where Daniel was standing at the side of the stage, and the look was the unmanaged one, the one without calculation. My relationship with Daniel began under circumstances neither of us would have designed. Her voice settling into something quieter than the press conference register. What it has become is not something I can describe to a room full of cameras in a way that would be accurate. But I can tell you that whatever Ashworth Communications does next, Daniel is part of what I'm doing next. She paused again. If he'll have me. He was looking at her from across the stage. He nodded once, not for the cameras, not as a performance, but as the response of a man who has already answered the question internally and is now simply confirming it out loud. The escrow account had been sitting in its financial holding pattern for 2 weeks when Claire placed the paperwork on the kitchen table of the estate, the kitchen where they'd had their first real morning together, which felt longer ago than the calendar suggested. She set the documents down without ceremony. This is yours, the final transfer. You sign it and the funds move tomorrow. He looked at the papers without touching them. The number was the number they'd agreed on in a sunroom 6 months ago, when he'd still been trying to figure out what kind of man answered a stranger's wrong number and drove across a city at 2 a.m. He understood the number better now. He understood the distance between what it had represented then and what it meant now. I have a different idea, he said. He explained it while she listened with the focused attention she gave to proposals that had been thought through. The Cole Ashworth Vocational Trust, structured as an independent foundation funding scholarships for vocational training with a specific emphasis on single parents and at-risk youth in the automotive trades. The first round of funding would come from the escrow. The foundation would be governed equally, him as executive director, her as co-founder, neither of them above the other in the structure. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. It's exactly right, she said, and the simplicity of the response carried more than an elaborate answer would have. Equal partnership, he said. Going forward, in all of it. She looked at him across the kitchen table, and the look held everything that the past 6 months had built between them, the hospital room, and the cafe, and the boardroom, and the cabin deck, and a daughter who had figured out the truth before either of them had been willing to say it plainly. I love you, Daniel Cole. No preamble, no strategic placement, no version of it optimized for reception, just the fact. Not because you showed up that night, because you kept showing up. Every hard morning after, every time it cost you something to stay. The words arrived with the weight of things that have been true for a while before they're spoken. He felt them settle. I love you too. His voice carrying the roughness that honesty sometimes produces when it bypasses the editing process entirely. For calling the wrong number. For being exactly the kind of impossible, stubborn, brilliant person I didn't know I needed. He paused. For letting Sophie teach you to see things you weren't looking for. She laughed, a real one, the kind that arrived unexpectedly, and he'd learned over 6 months that the unexpected ones were the ones that were entirely hers. The house was on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where people left their garage doors open on Saturday mornings and kids rode bikes on the sidewalks. It was a craftsman, a century old, with the kind of architectural character that came from having been built when the person building it was thinking about how the light would fall in the rooms rather than how quickly the materials could be sourced. Claire had bought it 3 months into the arrangement when she'd understood something about what she was hoping for that she hadn't been ready to name yet. She hadn't put a single piece of furniture inside. She showed it to them on a Saturday in early November, the 3 of them walking through empty rooms while the hardwood floors registered every footstep and the afternoon light came through the leaded glass windows in planes that moved as the clouds moved. Sophie found the window seat in the corner bedroom on the 2nd floor and sat in it immediately with the proprietary certainty of someone recognizing something that was already hers. "This is my room," she announced. "I want it blue, and we're getting a dog." Daniel looked at Claire. Claire looked at the window seat and the light, and Sophie's certainty, and then at him, and whatever she found in his face resolved into something quiet and decided. "One thing at a time," he said, and the phrase landed the same way it always did, which was not as a denial, but as a promise that the things were coming just in order. They moved carefully, selecting what came from each of their separate lives to make the house into something neither of those lives had been alone. His worn couch, which Claire had specified over anything in the estate because it was the kind of furniture that invited sitting rather than admiring. Her kitchen equipment, which was extensive and professional grade in a way that elevated the Sunday morning routine immediately. Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator door, which was the first thing any of them put anywhere before the beds were made or the boxes fully unpacked. The detached garage became his over the course of 2 weekends, a workspace, a thinking space, a place where he could work on the expansion plans for Cole's Auto and the foundation documentation, and the specific kind of problem-solving that required his hands to be doing something while his mind worked on something else. Ray had kept the shop running with a competence that had exceeded even Daniel's confidence in him, and the return from the arrangement, the operational, had a different quality, now the quality of something returned to rather than resumed. Claire's reduced schedule, the transition to chairwoman completed by mid-November, allowed for proper recovery between maintenance treatments. The change in her physical presentation over those weeks was not dramatic, but it was consistent. The way improvement usually is not a reversal, but an accumulation of small returns, color and steadiness, and the capacity to stay in a conversation past 9 in the evening without the words starting to run together. On a Tuesday in late November, Daniel was in the garage working through the foundation's charter documents when she appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and sat on the workbench the way Sophie sat on the overturned bucket at the shop, with the ease of someone who had stopped calculating whether they belonged in a space. "My mother called," she said. He looked up from the documents. "She wants to meet you." Claire wrapped her hands around her mug. "She's flying in from Boston the week before Christmas." She paused. "Fair warning, she's been on the Ashworth board since before I was CEO. She knows exactly what happened with Stiles, and she has opinions about everything, and she's going to ask you things that feel like questions but are actually assessments." "Boston," he said. "Born and raised. Moved back after my father died to be closer to her sister." She looked at him steadily. "She's not what people expect. She's sharper than anyone in those boardrooms, and she doesn't waste the sharpness on impressions. She'll ask about the shop and about Sophie and about what you actually think about things. If you're honest, she'll be satisfied. And if I'm not, she'll know before the sentence is finished." The corner of her mouth moved. "Sophie's already asked to be there for dinner. She has opinions about what to cook." He thought about a woman he'd never met who had raised the person across from him and who had apparently also survived whatever it meant to be the mother of Claire Ashworth, which struck him as a credential worth respecting. "I'll manage." "I know you will." She said it with the simple directness of someone stating something they'd verified. "That's not what I'm worried about." "What are you worried about?" She looked at her coffee. "That she'll like you more than she likes me. It's happened before with people I've brought home." She looked up. "You're more immediately likable." He laughed, and it was the laugh that came from being surprised into it which was his best kind. "I'll try to be adequately difficult." "Please don't. She responds well to genuine people, and I'd like her to have a good impression of the situation." The situation. He thought about the word and what it contained. A house with a window seat and a dog that hadn't arrived yet. A daughter who had chosen the blue for her room from 17 paint chips with the seriousness of someone selecting the color of a flag. A foundation that would spend its first year funding 4 scholarships and its second year funding 12 if the projections held. A woman sitting on a workbench in a garage drinking coffee like it was the most natural place in the world to be. "Is that what this is?" he said. "A situation?" She looked at him with the expression that only appeared in spaces where she wasn't performing anything. "No," she said. "That's not what this is." December arrived with the cold that Portland Decembers produced, not the sharp cold of the mountains, but the damp, pervasive cold that worked its way through anything inadequate and made the warm places feel earned. The house on the tree-lined street had a fireplace that they'd used 3 times already and that Sophie had decided was the primary feature distinguishing it from every other house she'd ever been in. On a Friday evening in the second week of December, Sophie was asleep upstairs. She'd moved in officially 2 weeks prior with more boxes than Daniel had expected and opinions about where everything went that she'd arrived with fully formed, and the house had the quiet that settled in once she was out for the night, which was a different quiet from the apartment fuller with more things in it. And he found Claire in the kitchen, which was where she'd taken to ending her evenings not working, just present the way people inhabit rooms they've started to trust. She'd been looking out the window over the sink at the dark backyard, and she turned when he came in. He had the box in his hand. He'd had it for 3 weeks, which was how long it had taken him to find the right moment. Not the staged right moment, but the actual one. The one that arrived without announcement because it was simply the continuation of something rather than the beginning of it. She looked at the box. At him. At the box again. He opened it. The ring was platinum, not a traditional cut, not the predictable architecture of the category. A single small gear machined with the precision that the design had required him to find a jeweler willing to attempt, surrounded by sapphires in the exact color of Sophie's eyes. She recognized what she was looking at before he said anything. He watched her understand the design, the mechanical at the center of his world, the most important color in his life arranged around it. Her breath caught in the specific way of someone receiving something they hadn't known was coming and recognizing it as correct. Claire Ashworth. His voice steady with the kind of steadiness that wasn't performed calm, but actual certainty, the kind that comes from having weighed something carefully and found the weight consistent. Would you do me the honor of answering my wrong numbers for the rest of our lives? She looked at him for a moment with something undefended in her face. All the architecture of control and management and professional presentation completely absent, just the person underneath it, which was the one he'd been watching emerge incrementally across 6 months of difficult circumstances and which he had found in its unguarded form to be the most interesting person he'd ever met. That, she said, her voice holding the waver of someone who is also laughing slightly, is the strangest proposal I have ever heard. Is that a yes? She extended her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit because he'd found her ring size through Sophie, who had accomplished this with a subtlety that suggested she'd been planning for longer than either of them had. Yes, Daniel Cole, her voice settling into something quiet and entire, the way a door sounds when it closes properly in a well-built frame. Every call, wrong numbers, right numbers, and everything in between, for as long as you keep making them. He kissed her, and the kitchen held them the way good rooms hold the things that happen in them, without comment, without ceremony, with the simple reliability of 4 walls and a roof that were doing exactly what they were built to do. From upstairs, Sophie's voice, "Dad, can I have water?" They looked at each other. "She knows," Claire said. "Absolutely she knows. Should we tell her tonight or let her come downstairs and see the ring?" He considered the options and their likely outcomes. She's going to come downstairs regardless. She just needed a reason. As if confirming this, footsteps appeared on the staircase, not the footsteps of someone who had just woken up, but the footsteps of someone who had been awake and waiting for the right moment to have a reason to come down. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, looked at the two of them, and looked at Claire's hand. Her face did the thing it did when she was trying not to show that she'd already known something. She managed it for approximately 3 seconds. "Finally," she said. Daniel pulled her in with one arm, and she leaned against him the way she'd leaned against him since she was 6 years old, and had decided that this was the correct position for the world to be received from. Claire put her hand on Sophie's back, which was where it had found its way more and more often in the past months, as naturally as hands find things they've been reaching for without knowing it. Outside, the December cold was doing what December cold does in Portland, settling into the streets, making the lighted windows glow against it, turning the ordinary landscape of a residential neighborhood into something that looked from inside a warm house like exactly enough. Sometimes a wrong number at 2 in the morning is the most accurate call a person ever makes. Sometimes the stranger on the other end is the person who is going to matter most, and the only question that remains is whether you have the particular kind of courage required to answer it. Daniel Cole had answered it in a hospital room and in a sunroom and at a cafe on Burnside where the coffee went cold, and in a boardroom where something that mattered was being decided, and on a porch in November when the daylight had run out, of reasons to be cautious, and now here in a kitchen in December, in a house that was becoming what houses become when the right people fill them. He'd answered it every time, and every time had been the right answer.